Hey everyone, my name's Colin. I host the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered podcast, and I am here to talk about my church story today, which really is just the story of my life because you can't talk about my life without talking about church. I grew up in it. It was a central part of my life from a very young age. So much so that actually I was baptized into the Catholic Church when I was a baby. That was the faith that my mom grew up with. But by the time that I was born, she wasn't satisfied with the Catholic Church, and she had been looking for something different. So when I was only a couple years old, we started attending a small Baptist church that was nearby where we lived. And we were there for a couple of years, but it was starting to transition more into like a broader evangelical style of church, which is not what my mom was looking for at the time. So she ended up going to an independent fundamental Baptist church one town over. And this is the church that I grew up in. This would be the church that I stayed in for 20 years. And for those of you who may not be familiar with independent fundamental Baptist, there are a broad variety of Baptists. You can have independent Baptist, you can have Southern Baptist, and there's all different flavors of it within each category. Baptists are generally in a Protestant variety, usually on the conservative side. But in the kind of fundamentalism that we were in, we didn't even identify as Protestants. We basically tried to trace Baptist faith all the way back to Jesus. Independent is really key when it comes to talking about this style of Baptist because it means that there was no hierarchy whatsoever. Each church was an island unto itself. And there were definitely benefits to that. It allowed each church to determine its own doctrine and practice, and it allowed them to accomplish more without having to go through a whole hierarchy. But the flip side of that coin is since you don't have the hierarchy of it, the church can change a lot with different leadership, and it doesn't have as much oversight as sometimes it may have needed. The other key there is fundamentalist. And if you were to ask a fundamentalist what it means to be fundamentalist, they would say that they believe in the fundamentals of the faith, which is usually going to be stuff like the virgin birth, the inerrancy of scripture, Jesus being a son of God, stuff like that. But it really became more about cultural touchstones and what we would call standards, like what kind of clothes you wear or music you listen to or movies you watch. That was a massive part of the faith that I grew up in. It was heavy on purity culture. Whatever you know of evangelicals being strict about things, take that and multiply it by like 10. It was a very intense way for a child to grow up. We were taught from a very young age about being sinful and going to hell and having to proselytize, evangelize our friends and family members. And that was very much the way my faith was. I looked for a lot of external validation as a child, particularly from adults seeing me as mature. And that led me to be what I often call the kind of kid that all the parents loved and all the kids hated, because the other kids knew I was a brat that could get away with whatever I wanted to. But in front of the parents, I always acted like the really good kid, the goody two shoes, had all the perfect standards, basically the preacher boy from a very young age. And that was the reputation that I had. I was the kid that was always winning the memory verse awards and trying to get family members and friends to come to church. And a big part of that at that age was that my dad had not gone into the Baptist faith the way that my mom had. So I remember being this little kid agonizing over the fact that my dad doesn't go to church with us and doesn't believe exactly like we do. Even though this would take me a very long time to figure out, my faith at that time was very fear-based and anxiety-inducing. And in that particular church, it was a decent-sized church, probably about 250 on average. And we would have a children's ministry for 1st through 6th graders, and then youth group for 7th through 12th grade. And then after that, you were just in regular adult services and everything like that. So when I was in the children's church, I was already having this reputation of helping out with things. And they had a junior usher program, which just meant you passed out candy and cleaned up chairs afterward. But, I would do things like that. So much so that by the time I was in 6th grade going into 7th, aging out of the children's ministry, I ended up staying in there and helping out as an assistant for the majority of services. So the kind of church we were in, we had Sunday school, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, revival services, missions conferences, and you were expected to be there every time the doors were open. And we were. So for the majority of my time growing up, once I got out of the children's ministry, I was just back in there serving, which I really loved at the time. Looking back on it now, it was a little problematic having someone who's only a few months or a couple years older than these kids teaching the kids. I was in 5th grade when I preached my first ever sermon. It was a 5-minute message on Jesus' feeding of the 5,000 that I did to win a merit badge in Master Club. And shortly after that, I started preaching very frequently in the children's ministry and even in adult services. When I was in 5th and 6th grade, we had this organization come in that was called Neighborhood Bible Time. This is vacation Bible school on steroids. Their main focus was getting you to evangelize the community, get out there, invite people into your church, and then try to get them saved. And their purpose was to go out into the community, get as many of the kids there as possible to come back for the service, where they would get all hyped up and hopefully decide to make this decision to get saved. And this was really, really central in the kind of church that I grew up in. Was like, we believed that salvation was, we would say it was more than just praying a prayer, but we were really trying to force you to pray the prayer. Like, we had this whole sinner's prayer laid out of, "Dear Jesus, I know that I'm a sinner. I know that my sin separates me from you. And I know that you died on the cross to save me from my sin. I pray that you would," kind of thing. So we really drove home trying to get kids especially, but anyone, to pray that kind of prayer and then hopefully keep them in the church. And this one particular year when we had this neighborhood Bible time, it resonated with my dad in such a way that he made this profession of faith, what we would call being born again there. That was a really crucial turning point for me as a kid, because I saw that as validation that God answers prayer. For many years after that, I would look back on this story and think of how often I would agonize over my dad not believing in Jesus the way that I did. And I would say, oh, this is how God answers prayer. And so my whole family became very involved in the church after that. We did basically everything. My dad headed up the ushers and church security. My mom was a church secretary, Sunday school teacher. I did everything from intern multiple times to being a janitor, basically everything except full-time paid staff. And the more that I did there, the more people were pushing me to go into full-time ministry as a pastor. This was something I was hearing every week. And when you're this young kid that's been taught that your ultimate goal in life is to please God, and what higher calling than to serve God in full-time ministry, that sits with you. And we definitely wouldn't say that people who weren't in ministry were second-class citizens, but that's kind of how it came across. It was like the highest thing you could possibly do with your life was go be a pastor. And this was something that we pushed only for the men. Highest calling for women would be to be a pastor's wife, or maybe a single missionary if they couldn't swing that. So lots of problematic things going on here. But that really became my identity of being this preacher boy that, oh, this is what God wants for my life. And I really believed that. Like, I look back on it now and sometimes I wonder how much of it was a conditioning of being around people who said, this is what you should do with your life. But it's not like I didn't believe that at the time. I really thought this is what I should be doing. So I start considering going to college for preaching, for pastoring. I'd say the next really big step in this journey for me was when I was in high school. I was homeschooled, by the way, K through 12, whole thing. I took this class. It was an elective. I think it was in 9th grade at the time. It was an apologetics course through Summit Ministries. And as I look back on it now, there's a lot that I would not agree with about it. There were definitely some problematic elements, but that class really changed my life. And here's why. Growing up, I was a very nerdy, precocious, bordering on obnoxious kid sometimes. If you know Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory, that was my personality back then, before I even knew that show existed, because again, fundamentalist, and it's talking about the Big Bang, so obviously that's got to be wrong. But I was very confrontational. I was very aggressive, very confident that whatever I believed was right. And that's what happens when you raise a child in militant fundamentalism. And this class taught me about other views. Now, of course, the goal was to show that our view was right and all those other views are wrong. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I actually understood why other people believed what they believed. And I understood that everyone believes what makes sense to them. And everyone's the hero of their own story. It's not just like, oh, we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, or we're always right and they're always wrong. So it really taught me logic in a way that I hadn't thought through up until that point. In fact, my mom would say for years after that she really regretted letting me take that class because she couldn't win arguments with me after it. So that class was super crucial for me because as I was going into college in the next few years, it really opened my mind up to being willing to consider other views. Where before I would have just been like, oh, you're different than me. I don't want to hear it. I know I'm right. Where now I'm like, okay, I want to know the truth. Obviously, I think I am right, but I'm willing to hear you out. And that way we can talk this through and see who's right. So that brings me to my college years. And this is a really wild part of the ride here because I wanted to go into Bible college and I wanted to go to one out on the West Coast. But for various reasons, that didn't work out. So I ended up going to this really, really, really small Bible college in rural North Carolina. And when I say really small, I mean like 150 students. No joke, the town was literally just 1 square mile. There were more sheep than people. And the president of the Bible college was the mayor of the town. So that's the kind of environment that I was in for 4 years here. And I am not a Southern boy, so I did not do well in North Carolina at all. Born and raised in New Jersey, just outside of Philadelphia. That is my culture. That's my people. So North Carolina was a rough 4 years. But it had a huge effect on me because it was a very, very, very conservative fundamentalist college. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what I'm talking about when I say that, there was a blacklist of what music you couldn't listen to. And that was anything that was popular music. So like nothing secular. A lot of movie soundtracks weren't allowed because of the association of the movie being like PG-13 or having curse words in it. If you're familiar with VeggieTales from growing up, that music wasn't allowed. And also, if you're familiar with VeggieTales, how's your deconstruction going now? And anything that had a beat, drums, anything like that, blacklisted. You weren't allowed to listen to it. We had 11 o'clock lights out where our phones were supposed to be on airplane mode. We had exclusively gendered dorms where the other gender wasn't allowed to step foot within it. We had chapel services every single day. We were expected to go out into the community for at least 2 hours every week and proselytize. There were super strict rules around dating and dress. You weren't even allowed to hold hands with whoever you were dating. Women especially couldn't wear pants or anything like that. All kinds of wild stuff. But that was the world that I grew up in. So it was relatively familiar to me, even though I didn't agree with all of the standards there. I fit in pretty well. And I think it was actually really good for me to be in such a conservative school at that time, because it meant that I got to rethink my faith and be the one asking questions. I didn't feel like I was being attacked or challenged by someone who was trying to question my faith. I felt like I was able to be the one who was questioning why I believed what I believed. And so one of the first dominoes in this whole series at Bible college was the church that I went to for the first couple years, because there was no central church there for that college. They had us go out into the community. They had like 40 approved independent fundamentalist Baptist churches you could go to. And so I went to this one where the pastor was very academic. Like I've been in a lot of churches and I have never heard someone preaching like this guy. And he really focused on 2 main hobby horses that I had never really heard before, and they really changed how I viewed the Bible. First one is realizing that the Bible is mostly for Christians. With the way I grew up, the Bible was about how to get saved, how to escape hell and go to heaven when you die. But this pastor pointed out, like, if you look at particularly Jesus, he very rarely talks about escaping hell and going to heaven. The majority of his message was about this thing that he called the kingdom of heaven, and saying that it had arrived now and that he was bringing this to earth. Basically, that he was trying to restore Eden where God and humanity can be at one again. And I had never considered the Bible being for Christians. I always thought of it as just being about how to escape hell. And so this really unlocked the whole of Scripture for me to say, oh, there is still so much that I can learn from this. It felt like a 101 course. And this showed me that you can go so deep into these passages and learn so much, because it's not just basic. Like we used to say, BIBLE, basic instructions before leaving Earth. It's like, no, it's not that. There's so much to get excited about here. So that was one thing that he really taught me that stuck with me. The other thing that he really focused on was the work of a scholar named Michael Heiser. Heiser passed a few years ago, but his expertise was in ancient Near Eastern culture, and particularly how the Old Testament, the Tanakh, draws on the culture of the people groups around it at the time, often in response to their mythologies. So a big part of this would be looking at how often the Bible refers to other gods like Baal or Ashtaroth or Dagon, and saying that they're not just the idols that we think of them as, but the ancient authors of scripture would have actually seen these as real supernatural beings who were in competition with Yahweh. It's not like whenever Israel went off after some other god, they were just going after an idol. They really were worshiping some other supernatural being. And there's all kinds of other nuances and weirdness to get into with that. But it really helped me understand that context matters when we're talking about the Bible. So through many long talks and fascinating sermons, that pastor really helped me rethink what it meant to study the Bible. And that meant that I had to start rethinking what I believe, because I realized what I believe right now is what I have been told to believe. And if I am going to go into ministry, I need to actually believe these things for myself. So this is a really important point to understand if you're going to follow my story when it comes to church and faith. And that's that I didn't deconstruct my faith because I wanted to sin or because I was sick and tired of the fundamentalism that I grew up in. No, actually, I ended up deconstructing because of the Bible. I went into this whole process. I kind of forced deconstruction on myself unintentionally. I went into it trying to prove that what I believed was right. But I just wanted to know that I had Bible backing it. And the more I studied, the more I realized, oh, I'm not always right. In fact, a lot of times the stuff I've believed has been wrong. So it really was like this domino effect where I would like go out on a long walk and say, okay, there's this thing that I believe about whatever topic, music or outfits or Bible versions. I came from King James only circles where that was the only accepted version of the Bible you could use, or like alcohol, entertainment, sexuality, basically every possible topic. I would just go for long walks and start thinking through all of this. I would pull up Bible software and get super nerdy with the meanings of particular Hebrew and Greek words and do all this. I'm a nerd. Okay. This is the kind of stuff I do for fun. I realize this is not your standard deconstruction story. I went at it from a very academic angle. And I was constantly trying to prove, all right, what I believe is right. But each time it was the Bible itself chipping further and further away at my beliefs. And back when I would preach more often, I would say that the Bible ruined my best sermons because I thought I had this really great Christian-y sounding point. And then when I would go into scripture and say, all right, let's back this up with Bible, it's like, oh yeah, that's not actually what that passage is talking about. So that leads me into kind of the next domino falling here, or pulling at the strings in the sweater, if I can mix metaphors. And that was my second year at college there. I took Greek, and it wasn't anything like ridiculous. It was just first year Bible college Greek. But that changed so much for me about how I was able to understand, read, and study scripture, because now I'm not reliant on some other person's study. I could look at these texts myself and say, oh, that word doesn't mean what I thought it meant. I remember sitting in there, again, very King James only school, and the professor being like, oh, the more you understand Greek and Hebrew, the more you're really going to appreciate the King James. And I remember sitting there going, not so much. Like, even now, as I'm, pretty fundamentalist conservative still at this point, I'm going, no, actually, I don't think you can truly have a grasp on biblical languages and believe that there is only one right version to use. Now, I do still really appreciate the King James. It's a beautiful version, but there's also really good ones that we have now that are much more up to date with modern scholarship. So that was a huge hurdle for me. And for some people, you might be going, really? That was a big deal? Yeah, that was huge, because King James onlyism was tied to biblical authority. So to question that this was the only right version to use was basically tantamount to questioning God. It really took a lot for me to be willing to work through that. And I was so uncomfortable through my years through college. The more I was pulling at these strings and realizing so much of what I'm being taught here is built on a foundation of what some people 100, 200 years ago believed was the best version of Christianity or the right standards to have. But it's not the only way to do it. Another really big step in the college journey for me was when I started dating Jana, my now wife, because it really forced me to see how damaging the purity culture I was raised with was. That was another thing that I thought was biblical because we're backing it up with all these Bible verses. But I didn't realize how much the mentality of purity culture had affected and infected my thinking and was causing me to look at myself and others in harmful ways. And that's something that really took me years. And I'd say, honestly, I'm still processing through in some ways, even years into being married now. As I rounded out my third year at Bible college, I was interning back home at the church I grew up in. And the pastor at the time, who was both a friend and a mentor to me, took me out to this preaching conference in Texas. Really cool experience, but here's why it was formative in my journey, because it introduced me to biblical counseling. At that particular stage in my life, I was starting to realize how often I was playing the therapist in my friend group and how frequently people were coming to me for advice. And like, I feel like I kind of need more training on this for how much I'm doing this. And, especially if I'm going to be a pastor, I should probably have a little bit of therapy training. So I started looking into biblical counseling, so much so that I actually ended up getting a master's degree in it and almost got a certification in it as well. Later on, I'd go on to get a certification helping women who had been in domestic abuse situations instead. And now when I look back on biblical counseling, there's a lot I would disagree with. It is not the same thing as Christian counseling. It is not the same thing as getting counseling from a Christian. I know it sounds like semantics, but biblical counseling a lot of times can basically just be take 2 verses and call me in the morning kind of thing. Like it tries to sound like it's keeping up with modern psychology, but it's really just about blaming whatever is going wrong in your life on some hidden sin that you have. So I started drifting out of that when I realized that I didn't really agree enough to follow through with the certification there. But it did still give me really good tools for working through therapy with people. And actually, I think the most important thing it showed me is that good theology doesn't just have Bible verses to back it up. Good theology has a good effect on your life, because you can back up any view with scripture. That's the thing with a proof text. You can find a verse in the Bible to back up literally whatever you want to, and then you can call it quote unquote biblical. But that doesn't mean that it's healthy. And so I started realizing that to have good theology, we need more than just proof texts. We need to see, as Jesus would say, what is the fruit of this belief? And if the fruit is rotten, that probably means that the belief is wrong, even if there's Bible verses that are being used to back it up. We should instead be looking for what beliefs have good fruit, and that's what we should be going after. So that was a big turning point in my thinking as well. And as I'm finishing up with that master's degree, a lot was changing in my life, because this was around the time I was getting married. I'm graduating. The pastor that had been a friend and mentor to me was stepping down from pastoring this church that I had been in for 2 decades. He had a lot of health issues and just wasn't able to keep up with it anymore. And he had worked to try to bring the church slowly out of fundamentalism. He realized this wasn't something you could do overnight, so he was really trying to just inch the church forward, and still very conservative Baptist beliefs, but just not the same cultural standards that we had before. Well, pretty much overnight when he stepped away, the remaining staff and deacons decided to do a 180 and get the church back into the fundamentalism that he had been trying to leave. My wife and I decided at the time that we were going to stay there in the transition process, because the church was without pastor for about a year. We agreed that we would try to be a voice of change from the inside. I had a lot of clout there in the church, from everyone knowing me as this golden child preacher boy. And even though this was not something that was like officially stated in public, I was on track to eventually pastor that church. And that was something that I was very interested in. That was what I thought was going to happen with my life. That's why when I finished Bible college, I went right back home to the church that I grew up in. And I thought I was going to live and die there. I was fully invested. My wife and I were teaching a Sunday school class, and she was the janitor at the church. And I was doing all kinds of stuff behind the scenes. And when the new pastor came on, I even helped to start the first counseling ministry that the church had ever had in its 70-year history. So we were planning to be there for the long haul. And I was really trying to dig my heels in and make a difference there and say, we don't all have to be this monolithic fundamentalist Christianity. There's room for difference and disagreement. And what I was really trying to do with the Sunday school class is focus on the context of the Bible and say, it's okay if we disagree. I would start a lot of my classes saying, I have 2 rules here. Number 1 is you don't have to agree with me. And number 2 is if you don't, let's talk about why. And there were a lot of people that liked that, but there were also a lot of people that didn't. And the ones that didn't tended to be the ones in leadership. I was getting cut from preaching. And the more the new pastor was there, the more I realized I couldn't agree with him and with the direction he was taking the church. His preaching was very much just focused on telling stories that he thought were entertaining And his interpretations of the Bible weren't based in any context of the scriptures themselves, but just more so like the kind of traditional preaching you could read in any Charles Spurgeon book. And there'd been an issue of spiritual abuse going on there for quite a while, where the one assistant pastor was very spiritually abusive. As far as I know, never physically or sexually, but emotionally, verbally, spiritually, very much so. He would lie, manipulate, gaslight, yell at people, backbite. Basically, anyone who worked on staff at the church left because of him. And the deacons and pastors said that they thought they had been handling it, but the behavior wasn't really changing, and the patterns were still there. And I was concerned about that because I had seen several other people I knew bring up issues with this, and nothing was really changing. And in fact, I even met with the pastor and expressed my concerns. And he acknowledged there were serious issues with the behavior of this assistant pastor, and that there were many times he didn't like having him on staff. But then within a few weeks, he was publicly praising that same staff member as being someone that he worked perfectly with in front of the entire church. I'm like, okay, at this point, you're lying to someone. It's either me, him, or yourself. And so after agonizing for months over what we should do and talking to multiple counselors that we respected and people that had been in ministry for a long time, my wife and I agreed it was time for us to leave this church that I really thought was going to be my entire life. And there had been a pattern whenever staff members would leave before, again, almost always because of this assistant pastor being a big issue, they would leave quietly, which means that they don't talk about the problems, which is part of why the problems endured, because we were trying to promote unity, and any honest telling of what had happened was seen as backbiting, slandering, causing division among the church, things like that. You weren't really allowed to share your grievances. And so my wife and I decided we weren't going to be like that. If we're going to leave honestly and tell people why. So I started doing that. I was telling people, we are leaving for these reasons. I don't agree with the new pastor, and I don't agree with the spiritual abuse going on or how it's been handled. And that got me called into a meeting very fast with the pastor and a couple of deacons. And I was given about 48 hours before this meeting. And in 48 hours worth of time, I contacted the majority of the former staff members who had left, and I got testimonies of what was wrong with this particular pastor's behavior. And so I ended up with, if I remember correctly, 17 pages of definitions of what spiritual abuse is and 8 pages of testimonies corresponding to those points saying this guy has been spiritually abusive and it has not been handled well. So I walk in with photocopied 25-page papers saying, here's the problem going on. And in that meeting, I was told that I was being divisive, disrespectful, letting the devil get a foothold, all these different things. And at one point, one of the deacons said to me, yes, we know he's a problem, but what do you want us to do? Fire him? If we do, good tithers will leave the church. And that particular deacon was a businessman. And so I said, well, you're a really good businessman, but this is not a business. This is a church. And I don't think that should be the main thing that we're worried about here. We have seen a lot of people leave this church because of his bad behavior. It is distracting from the worship of God. And I think that should take priority. I think those hurting people should take priority over somebody who's raking in a little bit of money. And it was at that point that I just realized there is no reconciling this whatsoever. That was on a Thursday. And so that Sunday was my last day in the church that I grew up in. And I didn't fully know at the time. There were so many conflicting emotions about it all, as you can imagine. I didn't entirely know the ramifications of it at the time, because it wasn't just leaving that particular church. It was also leaving fundamentalism officially. Mentally, I had left it a long time ago, but I was still trying to reform it from the inside. I had this bright idea that I could be like the Martin Luther of fundamentalism and reform it from the inside out. But the crazy thing about reformers is they tend to die young, either as martyrs or because of health issues. I was fast on my way to one of those two ends as well. So it was a break with the church, with fundamentalism, honestly, with a lot of Baptist faith in general. I really wouldn't call myself a Baptist now. I don't like any denominational label at this particular point in my life. I'm not saying they don't serve any purpose, but just for me, I don't feel like I fit in any particular fold. And at this point, that has also been a break with the church at large. We have not been members of a church since then. And that's been both a lot harder and a lot better for me than I thought it would be. because when my entire life was centered around this institution, and remember, I was homeschooled, so all of my friends were in the church, and I have a very small family, so church was basically my family too. And so going from having that kind of community that I'm seeing multiple times every single week and being validated in there every single week that I'm doing the right thing with my life, to have that suddenly gone has been a lot more challenging to deal with than I thought it would be. But by the same token, I also didn't realize how much I had just been going through the motions by that point of trying to fit in somewhere that I knew I didn't anymore. College changed me, and not in the ways that the college wanted to change me. It forced me to rethink my faith, and they would have been okay with that so long as I ended up back in the same general place. But it led me to a different place, and I started feeling like even though I know all these faces, it's not the same version of me. And it's not a real relationship when you feel like you have to put on a different version of yourself in order to be accepted by people. And that's what I was doing every single time I walked in church. Now, despite all that, I am not anti-church. In fact, I am quite enthralled with the idea of what church can and should be. I believe in what church can and should be. I just don't believe in the way that it often ends up looking in modern American Christianity. I think we've gotten many of our priorities wrong. And I personally believe that if Jesus were to walk into the majority of churches in America today, he would either start flipping tables or quietly walk out the back. I don't believe that's how it has to be, though. And so I do still very much consider myself a Christian. At this point in my faith journey, I would say I am a progressive Christian, but I hold that label loosely. I am much more interested in the good that you are doing with your life than a particular label. I don't think you have to be exactly like me to be right or to be doing something good with your life or to be following God. And I definitely wouldn't say I have all the answers now. Come talk to me again in 5 to 10 years, and I'll probably have a little bit of a different story to tell. I think that's healthy. That's the way it's supposed to be. If you can go 5 to 10 years and nothing has changed about what you believe, then that means that your beliefs are stagnant, that you haven't grown, that you haven't changed as a person. And if we're being humble and honest with ourselves, there's no way that everything we believe at any stage of our lives is 100% right. So there should still be things that are growing and changing. So at this particular stage in my faith journey, I have found community mostly online through podcasts like Almost Heretical and Bible for Normal People, and through groups like Theology Beer Camp with Trip Fuller. So when we left that church, I was teaching a Sunday school class, and I realized even if I'm not teaching that class anymore, I'm still going to be studying the Bible just because I'm a nerd. And I think it's an incredible book with so much that we can learn from about how to live life, that I told the class, I'm like, well, I'm going to keep studying this stuff. And if you want to keep studying it with me, let's try a podcast format. And so I started up the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered, basically just as an extension of my Sunday school class. And now we've just passed 2 years with it, and it has grown to where most of the people listening are people I've never even met from all across the country and even some other countries. So I am still thoroughly Christian, and I still find so much meaning and hope in the Bible and the life of Jesus. And it's through groups like that and through interactions I've had with the podcast and being able to do stuff like this that gives me hope that the church will continue to grow, mature, and change so that it will get better in our lifetimes. It won't be perfect. It never will. But I think we can keep making it a little bit better as we tell these stories and learn from each other. So at this stage in my life, I may not sit in a pew anymore, but I haven't given up on Jesus or on the dream of what church could be. I still believe in a community shaped by love, justice, and grace. If we can strip away the fear, the power games, the gatekeeping, I honestly believe we can rediscover what church was meant to be. And if we can do that, I'll be the first one to pull up a chair. Thank you all for listening as I shared my story. I hope it has been of some encouragement to you, or maybe some solidarity to you, or maybe you just think I'm a weird nerd, which you'd be right. If you'd like to connect with me or share any of your story or hear more of mine, I would love to hear from you. I'm on all the socials with the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered, and we have an email on there as well, cconn@thebibleuncut.com. I'd love to hear from you all. And no matter where you are on your faith and church journey, if it's anything like mine or nothing like mine, I pray God continues to guide and bless you in it.